So welcome everyone to this evening's constitutional conversation where our guest is Professor Christina Wolbrecht of Notre Dame's Political Science Department. She's an especially appropriate speaker for us tonight because of the conjunction that this year is both the 100th anniversary of the 19th Amendment, which granted a constitutional right to women to vote throughout the country. And it's also an election year. You may have heard of that. Not much attention is being paid, but it is happening. And she is possibly our nation's leading scholar on the topic of women voting and what impact it has had on American politics. She's in 2000, she published a book entitled The Politics of Women's Rights, Parties, Positions, and Change, which is all about this question of, what has been the impact of women voting on the parties, on political positions, and on social and political change. In 2017, she followed up with a co-authored book entitled Counting Women's Ballots, Female Voters from Suffrage Through the New Deal. And then in 2020, that's just this year, I assume it's out now, A Century of Votes for Women, American Elections Since Suffrage. And she is co-editor of the journal Politics and Gender. And so what could be more timely than that? And so I turn it over to you and welcome you, Professor Wolbrecht.
Thank you, Michael. It is really my pleasure to be here. I commend all of you. At this point, as a professional political scientist, I don't think I can stand to hear another word about politics. So I appreciate you being here tonight for this conversation. I'm going to go ahead and share my screen. And what I'm hoping to do with you tonight in sort of my opening comments is just give some background for thinking about women voters. The good news is we are going to make it to 2020 and talk a little bit about what we might expect to see in this presidential election. So as Michael mentioned, we are, of course, celebrating the centennial of the 19th Amendment to the United States Constitution. The 19th Amendment says you cannot discriminate on the basis of sex when it comes to voting rights. It is patterned exactly after the wording of the 15th Amendment, but changing race, color, and previous condition of servitude to just say sex. There were, of course, many women in places like California that were able to vote. Now I've said that, and I'm not sure that's true about California. But I do know it's true of my home state of Oregon, who were able to vote in advance of 1920 because states passed laws giving women the right to vote. And one of the things I'd be happy to talk about in the Q&A is how important it is that it's really states that administer elections. The federal government has remarkably little to do with that. And that has real impacts on how voters really experience the right to vote. So since women have entered the electorate, there's been a lot of interest in how they're going to vote. The enfranchisement of women is the single largest enfranchisement in American history. In some level, it pretty much doubled the size of the electorate. And that means that women always have the capacity to have a very big impact on elections. One of the themes, however, I'll be trying to convince you of in my short remarks is that there is, however, not any woman voter, despite the popularity of that term. It turns out that women are just as diverse in their interests, in their ideas, and their identities as men are. And we're going to see that really understanding that is key to understanding what we might expect of women in this coming election. Since 1980, women have been more likely to turn out than men, and that remains the case today. And so in this graph, women's turnout in the purple and men's in the gold, sort of showing that they move in very similar ways, but that women are consistently now more likely to turn out than are men. This is true across, for example, different racial groups. It's actually true across most different divisions that you might imagine. I want to emphasize that we're now in a period in which the highest rates of turnout are observed among white women and Black women, whose turnout at least equals and in some cases exceeds that of white women. And both of them much more than white men, and particularly more than Black men. This is actually a pretty interesting consistent finding, I should say. This is averaging over the last 5 presidential elections. Given that women still continue to have less access to many of the resources we associate with turnout, less access to professional careers, for example, higher incomes, and so on. And nonetheless, we see these really high rates of turnout among women. And again, something I'm happy to talk about during the Q&A. You've probably heard a lot about the gender gap. So I just briefly talked about turnout. Let's talk about vote choice. This is a graph of the gender gap from 1952 through until 2012. Let me be clear about, and I'm going to talk more about this at the end, what we mean when we say the gender gap. The gender gap is the percent women voting, usually for the winning candidate. Here, for comparison, I've done it in terms of the Democratic candidate, minus the percent of men voting Democratic. What that means is when the gender gap is a negative number, women are actually voting more Republican than men are. And that was actually the case in the United States in many elections prior to about 1964. This is actually a worldwide phenomenon. In most advanced industrial democracies, in the period immediately following women's enfranchisement, women were more favorable to parties on the center right than men were. So parties like the German Christian Democrats in Germany, some of the Catholic associated parties in Latin America, for example. Since 1980, however, women have been significantly more likely to vote Democratic than are men. Importantly, and I'm going to talk about this, it might be better to say that men are more likely to vote Republican than women are. And every election since 1980, we've had a lot of attention to this gender gap. Is it getting bigger? Is it smaller? What's causing it? What can Democrats do to take advantage of it? What should Republicans try to do to ameliorate that? Just one way to see the sort of impact of the gender gap. This is a Google Ngram. You might be familiar. This is sort of the rate at which certain terms appear in books and other sources over time. And from 1920 until 2010, the use of the phrase gender gap. And as you can see, it really doesn't even exist as a term until 1980, and then comes into more widespread use. I'm also happy to talk about the fact that that term actually was created by feminist activists. It was a tool, it was a strategic term meant to emphasize the political relevance of women voters. It's used in lots of other ways now, but the gender gap itself, I think it's important to say, is part of a political strategy. So how can we explain the gender gap? Most explanations for the gender gap have 2 sort of characteristics. One is they emphasize some issue on which Democrats and Republicans differ, whatever that might be, but some way in which the parties are polarized. And then they point out that women and men tend to differ on that issue. I could have a lot to say about whether or not that's the right way to think about the gender gap, but I think our dominant explanations take that form. Historically, and to this day, there's often this assumption or presumption that the gender gap is a response to women's issues, right? And this sort of makes sense. If women are different than men in some aspect of their voting, wouldn't it seem natural that it would be because the parties are different on sort of feminist issues or women's issues, however you want to define them? And the timing of the gender gap, we're coming out in 1980, makes it very natural to assume that that's what happened. So the topic, as Michael said in my first book, was on how the parties polarized on women's rights issues. And the reality is that into the early 1970s, the parties weren't very polarized on these issues. So for example, when the Equal Rights Amendment, I feel this is a constitutional thing, so I have to keep talking about Constitution where I can. When the ERA was passed by Congress, the vote was overwhelming and was bipartisan. Both parties supported the the Equal Rights Amendment in 1972. Just 6 years later, however, when Congress voted on extending the deadline for the Equal Rights Amendment, it was Democrats who overwhelmingly supported that extension and Republicans who tended to oppose it. By 1980, with the nomination of Ronald Reagan as the standard bearer for the Republican Party, Republicans very publicly removed the Equal Rights Amendment from their platform. The Republicans had been on record in support of the Equal Rights Amendment since the 1940s, so this was a historic shift. And for the first time, took a clearly pro-life stance, in fact, using language that we still see in Republican platforms today. On the other hand, Democrats, who had actually traditionally been not that enthusiastic about the ERA, mostly because of the impact they expected it would have for labor unions, took a very strong position in support of the ERA, and took, again, the strongest they had taken thus far, position in support of women's right to choose. So in that same year, here comes this big, or sort of a significant gender gap. And in fact, those very activists who gave us the term gender gap wanted to argue that this was sort of the punishment that Reagan was getting. This is Reagan shaking hands with Phyllis Schlafly for reversing course on women's issues. The problem with that explanation that has been rejected really by social scientists since the early 1980s is that in reality, women and men do not differ that much in their preferences when it comes to women's issues. For example, this is support for abortion if a woman's health is seriously endangered from 1970 through until 2020. What you can see is that women in orange and men in gray are not particularly distinguished in their views on support for this aspect of abortion. If anything, men in more years than not are actually more pro-choice than women are. We see something similar if we look at sort of the other end of the abortion scale, support abortion if a woman is married but does not want to have more children. Again, less support for this idea, but nonetheless, we see men actually being more supportive. That doesn't mean that we don't still see this sort of idea very popular in the press, including among those who look really careful at this data. So this is a write-up by Nate Silver in 2012, when the scandalous thing that Mitt Romney had said about women is that there are binders full of them, still really emphasizing the role of abortion per se on the emergence of the gender gap. I like to say that Nate Silver is the nemesis of lots of women in politics scholars. That's mostly tongue in cheek, but nonetheless, he's really been resistant to those of us who have talked about the other sorts of explanations. Things are a little bit more persuasive when we focus on another aspect of party difference and of gender difference in public opinion. And so I'm probably not surprising anyone here by telling them that the parties are fairly polarized on positions on the social welfare state. And that is to say, how big government should be and how engaged it should be in things like programs for the poor, but also in funding public education and funding healthcare, et cetera. Around this same time, as we get the sort of emergence of the gender gap in 1980, the parties have increasingly polarized around these issues as well. So starting with Lyndon Johnson in the 1960s and the Great Society programs meant to alleviate the problems of poverty in the United States, the Democrats have put themselves even more so, certainly in the lane they've been since the New Deal, on the side of an expanded government addressing the needs of its citizens. Republicans, however, have gone a different direction, also starting in the 1960s, first with Barry Goldwater, and then, of course, with Ronald Reagan, who sort of famously describes government as not the solution, but rather the problem. And so this idea that government should come in and address problems in education, address problems in healthcare has not been the Republican position for quite some time. This is important because it turns out that women are, in fact, more likely than men to support expanding the social welfare state. So if you ask, is government spending too little money on assistance to the poor? Women are much more likely to say that the government is doing too little as opposed to just enough or too much. We see a similar pattern, and this again, same survey over the last 40 years. Women are more supportive of spending more. They say we're spending too little on education, and they like to say that we are spending too little on healthcare. I'm happy to talk in greater detail about that, why that might be, but I want to emphasize one thing in particular right now. One explanation often given is that women are somehow more compassionate and caring, they're communal, we have all of these long-standing cross-national stereotypes about women. There's not a lot of evidence, however, that it is women's sort of innate compassion that is driving these outcomes. Rather, women's relationship to government is simply different than men's, that their place in the socioeconomic and political structure is different. One way that most people think of is that women are more likely to be beneficiaries of social welfare programs. In the United States, our idea of who deserves government help is pretty limited, and mothers with small children is one of those places in which we're okay with government programs helping citizens. And so women are just more likely to be the beneficiaries of these sorts of programs. I also want to highlight, these are all, I should say, social welfare, education, healthcare, things that, for example, labor unions are more likely to favor and members of labor unions. No one really talks about the Teamsters being more compassionate. Yet these are also the sort of policies that women have an economic interest in. Certainly, as women were dramatically shifting into the workplace in the late 60s and 70s and 80s, the vast majority of the jobs that women were taking were in the education sector, the health sector, and then the social welfare sector, right? Women are teachers, women are nurses and doctors, women play all of these roles. And so in a simple sort of economic self-interest sense, women have more of a reason to support an expanded government in these different ways. The other thing that's going to happen around exactly the same time is that the parties are going to polarize around race. Democrats, traditionally the party of white supremacy and segregation, transformed themselves in the middle of the 20th century, particularly with the Civil Rights Act, which Lyndon Johnson is here signing and shaking Martin Luther King's hand, and the Voting Rights Act in the 1960s. At the same time, Republicans, on sort of a libertarian or small government argument, have been less supportive of civil rights programs. This is a picture of, I just like pictures of presidents signing bills. This is Ronald Reagan signing the bill for Martin Luther King Day, a proposal that he opposed until he really had no choice but just to sign it. I also want to point out that social welfare and voting and racial issues are not unconnected. The other sort of dynamic that's happening over this same period is the racialization of social welfare as an issue, and this is very well established. Before the 1960s, when people thought about poverty, they thought mostly about rural poverty, they thought mostly about white people, and they thought mostly about working class whites. So this is John Kennedy with coal miners in the early 1960s. After 1965, the images of poverty and social welfare in the United States become increasingly racialized. This is a Black woman who's literally the woman Reagan was speaking of when he talked about welfare queens. Our images of welfare are much more urban and really focused on Black women in particular. It turns out Americans' support for programs that help the poor change, I should say white Americans' views about programs that should help the poor change when they increasingly believe that these programs are really for minority communities. Just one quick piece of evidence of this. This is a quote from Newsweek when the Congressional Black Caucus met with Donald Trump in 2017. One of the members was trying to explain to Donald Trump how detrimental this would be for her constituents, adding that welfare reform would be, that not all of them are Black. The president, the Newsweek reports, was incredulous. Really? Then what are they? It should be said that the modal recipient of social welfare in the United States is a white person. It turns out that just as with social welfare, women are more supportive of civil rights and are more racially tolerant. So believing, for example, that racial differences are due to discrimination is something women are more likely to say than men. I also want to mention that when we talk about the gender gap, we really focus on women voters specifically. This is sort of a broader pattern in which whatever men do in politics is the normal thing because politics is men's thing and not women's thing. And so any difference must be the fact that women are doing something different or strange. The reality is that most of the original movement that caused the gender gap to emerge in the 1980s was on the part of men, not women. This graph is showing percent identifying with the Democratic Party, men in yellow, women in purple. Again, from 1952 to 2016. What I want you to see is that in 1964, when voters really repudiated Barry Goldwater, men and women were equally likely to identify with the Democratic Party. As that sort of fell off over time, the decline was much sharper among men. A lot of this is Southern white men seeing a party that they increasingly don't think is for them. But we see this in other places as well, that to the extent that the Democratic Party becomes the party of civil rights, of women's rights, of gay rights, et cetera, white men increasingly moving away from the Democratic Party. That is all the background, but let's talk about what's actually going to happen in a couple of weeks here. And to do that, I want to first talk a little bit about the 2016 election. There were widespread expectations that we would see an enormous gender gap in 2016. On one hand, we had the first woman ever nominated by a major party as their presidential nominee. On the other hand, we had a Republican candidate who was caught on tape saying pretty terrible things about women and had been credibly accused of doing a number of fairly misogynistic things. And so NPR on the top here, 538 below, the many sort of outlets that were predicting we're really going to see a big gender gap because of this election. So here's our picture of the gender gap, 1952 to 2012 again. I want you to all to prepare yourselves because I'm going to reveal to you the 2016 gender gap. If you missed it, let me show it to you again. Here it comes. 2016 gender gap was not particularly large in historic sense. This is about a 6 to 7 point gap. Depending on the source you're using, I'm using a very good one. Other good ones exist. The numbers are going to be a little bit different, but we really are not seeing a particularly large gender gap. So I want to talk a little bit more about why that is. I want to point out that there's very little evidence that people leave their partisan identification. Let me be more specific, that women who think of themselves as Democrats vote Republican if Republicans nominate a woman, or Republicans, Republican women who think of themselves as Republicans vote for a Democrat just because they nominate a woman. That's just simply never been a pattern that we have seen. I said I was going to emphasize the diversity of women voters, and I want to do that for you now, in part to really highlight who we should be paying attention to on election day. This is support for the Republican Party among white men and women on the left and African-American men and women on the right. I want you to notice a couple of things. One, there's a gender gap amongst both groups. In both groups, women are less likely to vote Republican than are men. I also want you to notice that those gender gaps are tiny compared to the size of the racial voting gap. White women look much, much more like white men in terms of their voting preferences than they look like Black women and vice versa. And in fact, a majority of white women in 2012 voted for Mitt Romney and had actually fairly consistently, we see in presidential elections, the majority of white women supporting the Republican candidate. They're just slightly less supportive of the Republican candidate than are white men. So what happened in 2016? When we look overall, we see almost no change among white voters, right? We go from Mitt Romney to Donald Trump, and the overall level of white support for the Republican candidate is virtually unchanged. Don't worry, I'm going to complicate that in just a second. Similarly, we don't see much of a change in the African-American community. At most, you might say that African-American men and women became more likely to vote Republican because of Trump. I think most experts on racial voting would argue that this is actually in 2016 a return to sort of more normal level of support for Republican candidates in the African-American community. What you're really seeing in 2012 is the overwhelming support of African-American voters for Democrats when Barack Obama is at the top of the ticket. But it turns out that this doesn't look like much change, but it's hiding some change that was probably pretty important for Donald Trump's election. So this graph is only showing white voters. On the left are men and women who do not have a college degree, and on the right are men and women who do have a college degree. Again, there's a gender gap in both groups of white voters. However, those without a college degree are slightly less likely to vote Republican than are white voters without a college degree. That's something of a change, I should say, historically. So what happened in 2016? We see a swing towards Donald Trump among white voters without a college degree. I want to point out, however, that the swing among white men without a college degree is actually quite small. It is among white women without a college degree that we see the most dramatic shift towards Donald Trump in 2016. In fact, so much so that we no longer see the traditional gender gap. Women are actually as enthusiastic, white women without a college degree, that is, are as enthusiastic about voting for Donald Trump, or even more so, than are white men. The way I like to say this is all of those New York Times reporters that are talking to men in diners in Pennsylvania should be talking to the waitresses instead. That's where the action is. We see a similar pattern, but in the reverse direction among whites with a college degree. Both men and women became less likely to vote for Republicans in 2016, but the shift among white men with a college degree is pretty small compared to a pretty large shift among white women with a college degree. The white women without a college degree were already the least likely to vote for Republicans, and they become much more so in 2016. I'm happy to talk about this more in the Q&A, but the simple reason for why Donald Trump keeps talking about suburban women, by which he seems to mean white women, even though the suburbs have become incredibly racially diverse over time, is because he's got to hold on to non-college educated white women, and he's hoping to bring back some college educated white women. Those were the shifts, particularly among non-college educated white women, that really helped him in states like Michigan, Wisconsin, Pennsylvania. And so keeping those voters is going to be really important. I want to point out that we see with much bigger confidence intervals, similar shifts among Black voters as well. So Black voters without a college degree, men and women, became more likely to vote Republican in 2016. Black voters with a college degree became less likely to do so. And in fact, in 2016, our best estimate is that no Black voters with a college degree voted for Donald Trump. The lack of a confidence interval there means that our best estimate is 0. It's almost certainly not 0 in real life, but the number is very, very small. So what are women going to do in 2020? Let's take a look at what we know right now. This is the most recent national poll that breaks it down by gender, a poll that ended just a couple of days ago, done by The Economist and YouGov. Those are good, dependable polls that I would pay attention to. I want to sort of remind you of what we mean when we say the gender gap. This is the difference in the preference among women for the winning candidate, or the presumed or looks like probably going to win candidate, at least in the popular vote, minus the percent of men supporting that candidate. And so with 51% of women saying they're going to vote for Biden and 43% from among men, we have a gender gap of 8 points. Again, if you remember back, that's a fairly, it's a good gender gap. It's again, not historically very different. You will sometimes hear a bigger number, and here again, I am talking about my nemesis, Nate Silver. In 538, they talk a lot, and in other places, a lot about a gender lead, and sometimes they even call this the gender gap. And the truth is, the lead that Joe Biden has among women is 14 points. So 37% say they're going to vote for Trump versus 51% say they're going to vote for Biden. In comparison, the lead is actually -1 among men, right? There's a 43 to 44 difference there. Men are actually slightly more likely to vote for Donald Trump, although in statistical terms, those numbers are pretty indistinguishable. Those numbers tend to look bigger, and you will hear lots of talk of 17, 18 points. Usually they're talking about a gender lead. What I've seen in terms of a gender gap is still fairly in keeping with what we've seen historically. And with that, I am going to stop talking, and I look forward to hearing your questions. So thank you very much.
Thank you, Christina. That was really interesting and very timely, as Michael alluded said at the beginning of your talk. Just sort of picking up on the last part of your discussion about what's coming up in this election and your nemesis, Nate Silver. I'm curious if you could talk a little bit about how political journalists and these sort of like niche polling journalists like Nate Cohn at the New York Times should be reporting on this question of the disparity in polling, where it seems that women overwhelmingly support Biden over Trump. How should they be talking about that so that voters better understand the nuances that you're getting at?
So the question really, and this is true of any sort of statistical measure, is it depends on what do you want to know, right? And so often the question is, you want to know, do women want a different outcome than men? And one of the interesting things about the gender gap is now that we're in a period of such close electoral competition, we are seeing more and more a slight majority of women on one side and a slight majority of men on the other. That certainly happened in 2012. If only men had voted, the majority preferred Mitt Romney. But even without that, right, if you're fundamentally wanting to say, are women different in their preferences than men, then you want to compare women to men, right? And that would be that sort of traditional gender gap measure that I described. What percentage of women want a candidate versus what percentage of men want a candidate. And that's really how we think about it. Now, if you want to describe a group itself, to say, my gosh, women really do not support Donald Trump and they really support Joe Biden, to talk about that gender lead, to say that, Biden is leading by 17 points over Trump among women, would be a perfectly appropriate thing to say. And to say men are equally divided on Biden and Trump, like they don't have a strong preference. I think sometimes it gets very easy, and I know I do it myself all the time, that there's some slippage in our words, and we get a different a kind of conclusion. Let me give one example. It turns out that in 1980, the year that we all discovered the gender gap, women were split on Reagan. It was like 49-49. So if you've been talking about the gender lead, and actually the first people to cover those numbers were like, wow, Reagan didn't really suffer at all. Most, half of women wanted him, half of women wanted Carter. What's the big deal, right? So going against women's rights is not hurting him. But of course, the smarter people looked and said, yes, but men were so much more supportive of Reagan than women were. I have a whole section in our most recent book where we talk about the problem of the male standard. Sometimes we act like whatever men do is like a normal thing, and oh my God, what's up with women? But nonetheless, if you were to look at the lead in 1980, you wouldn't think there was anything really to talk about. The flip is, if you look at the lead in 2020, you may get this impression that it's enormous and historic. And in some ways, I suppose it is, but in other ways, it's really not.
Another question sort of gets at how we think about women voters. When we talk about women, that sort of sounds like a monolith. And so drilling down to sort of have a more nuanced view of what we're really talking about. For example, there are married women versus single women. Do these different types of women vote differently? Are there big differences? Is that true, or is that an assumption that we have? And does it matter?
So it matters a lot. I will quote my friend and colleague, Corinne McConaughey at Princeton, who likes to say, women do not vote as a united sisterhood, but they do vote in terms of their gender. Like, they are different. And that's because, again, well, it could be many reasons. It could be because women are innately different and have different values and preferences. It could also be because we know that women continue to have a different sort of place in the economy and professions, et cetera, et cetera. It is in fact the case that married women, well, let me say it this way. Marriage is a great example. Single women with children are amongst the most democratic group you can find. In general, married women are much more likely to vote Republican, but that's true of married men as well. So married men are also more likely to vote Republican than are single men. And this is, of course, where we have to kind of get serious about what we would call sort of a multivariable analysis, right? It turns out that marriage is not randomly distributed within the population. It used to be more randomly distributed, but today it's very raced and classed. People who have more education, more income, and are white are more likely to get married, even given all the other changes we see in marital stability and entrance into marriage. So there does seem to be, above and beyond that, something about marriage. And what that is, there are some people that would say, well, women get married and they listen to their husbands and their husbands tell them what to do. And I can tell you this idea that women vote as their husbands tell them has been around since before suffrage. It might alternatively be that when people get married, they tend to buy houses, they tend to have children, and they frankly are more conservative. It also might be that conservative people are more likely to get married, right? And so there's a lot of dynamics going on there. But I absolutely would want to reiterate your opening point that women are not one big cohesive group any more than men are one big cohesive group.
Tying, kind of going back to this particular election and maybe violating the point that I just made about women not being a cohesive group. I am curious, and a couple of our members of our audience and myself as well, curious if we find women reacting differently and perhaps negatively to Donald Trump's campaign style, which is more bombastic and aggressive, to say the least, in terms of kind of compared to the norm that we've come to expect from folks campaigning for the presidency. Does that have a particular effect on women voters?
So I want to say a couple of things about that. One is to admit what I don't know, which is that I don't know of studies, that doesn't mean they don't exist, that have specifically looked at that question about his style. I think it is fair to say that at this point, however, that style is sort of baked in. Now, it's hard for the kind of people that show up for a lecture like this on a Thursday night to realize, but lots of people actually don't pay that much attention to politics and to elections. And so there is probably a group of voters who were a little surprised once he became president and that he didn't translate from this sort of bombastic campaign style to a more presidential set of behaviors. Whether or not that's particularly gendered, I don't know. It's important to say that sexism, controlling for everything, including party, was a predictor of vote in 2016, and had not been a predictor of presidential vote choice in other recent elections. It turns out, however, that women are also sexist, right? And so you can have Me Too and you can have Not All Men. And in fact, lots of women see their own interests is tied into the interests of men. My husband could be accused of something, or my husband could lose his job because Donald Trump's going to defend against us in China, or whatever it is, right? And so in the same way that racism is also something we can see among men and women, we also see sexism among men and women. Where I think the changes in 2020 is that women have been particularly affected by the pandemic and by the financial crisis that goes along with it. Women are in professions that have lost their jobs and lost their stability. They are bearing the burden of children at home and about homeschooling that's going on. They're frontline workers like nurses and school teachers. And it's those sorts of interests that I would not be surprised to see after 2020 explain whatever shift we see in women voters. And that may be why Donald Trump is having a hard time retaining those women without a college degree.
It's interesting that you raised the pandemic. One of our members asked perhaps this is not something we could quantify on the fly, but maybe you're aware of some studies that might have looked either quantitatively or qualitatively at the extent to which the pandemic has influenced voters' attitudes to social welfare, and if those changes have been consistent or different across not just gender, but race and perhaps class as well.
So it's a really great question, and it's the place we want to be looking. part of our struggle in the midst of an election is that the instant polls, the ones that finish on one day and are reported the next, are often good. I think highly of YouGov and The Economist, for example. But in order for them to be constantly polling, they're not asking a whole lot of questions. These are really short sort of questions. And so some of that data that I was showing you on attitudes about abortion and social welfare, those are from the General Social Survey. That is a many hours long survey where the data is not released until 6 months later. And so there have been, in fact, it was mentioned that I edit the journal Politics and Gender. We did a special rapid review series on COVID, and there's great work on masculinity and mask wearing and on the performance of women in political office during the pandemic. But I don't think we're quite there, but there are lots of signs, right? So the unemployment numbers for women are terrible. Previously, we have good reason to believe that women are, in their voting, are particularly responsive to economic downturn. They seem to feel it more and become more pessimistic. So those are just where we are at this point.
On a different topic, one of our audience members is curious if there are any studies that relate to the differences among women voters turning on the abortion issue specifically. I know you spoke a bit about that, but.
Yep. So it certainly makes sense, and there's some evidence to expect that women would prioritize women's issues, whether it be abortion or equal pay, sexual assault, all those sorts of issues to a greater extent than men. And there is some evidence that when you ask voters across a range of issues, what matters the most to you, that women are more likely to say those issues. The problem is that the vast majority of men and women are even much more likely to say they care about the state of the economy, they're worried about employment, they're worried about foreign policy and going to war, those sorts of issues. It's also worth saying, and I mean this again with love, that voters are not always the best judges of what is actually affecting their vote choice. The truth of the matter is, I like to say that I decided who I was going to vote for about 40 years ago because we learn about partisanship and what group we belong to and the kind of party that people like us support as children, and partisanship is incredibly stable over the course of the life cycle. Now, something like a pandemic might move it around a bit, but it's pretty stable. The last thing I'll say is we may see something different in this election, given, again, I know I'm talking to a law school, the nomination of my colleague Amy Coney Barrett to the Supreme Court. But generally, it's actually pro-life voters who are more likely to be single issue voters and to prioritize that about other things. Pro-choice voters, and there are of course lots of pro-life women voters, pro-choice voters on the other hand tend to be less focused on abortion. That doesn't mean there aren't lots of women voters who care deeply about reproductive issues. It's just not quite as dominant as we see on the other side.
It's interesting. Maybe this is more of a philosophical question, but I'm curious. It seems like when we talk about abortion and you discussed this idea that women would vote for women, it seems that there are a lot of assumptions about who women are as voters and how they're going to behave. Yep. Can you just kind of weigh in on where you think those ideas might come from? Why we sort of attach this sort of baggage to women as voters?
So one of the very first papers I wrote after 2016 was about Donald Trump and gender. And one of the arguments I made in that paper is that Donald Trump's language and approach to running against a woman is not new. It's in fact part of a very long history of thinking about women in politics that helps us understand why women didn't have the right to vote before 1920. And that is part of our sort of basic understanding as well. And I'll just give two examples. Calling Clinton a nasty woman. The idea that women who get into politics have basically debased themselves. There were literally suffrage posters where it would be like, you can choose the home and there'd be like a nice woman with her child or the street corner. Like literally that's your choice when it comes to suffrage, right? Lock her up. Our expectations that women politicians are more honest, ethical, collaborative, all those sorts of ideas. And so any woman who fails at those things, the idea is really disappointing to us and really going against our stereotypes. sometimes those stereotypes help us elect women. When voters are in an anti-incumbent mood, women are the ultimate non-incumbents because they're not incumbents. And when we like these ideas of honesty, et cetera, women can do very well. But there definitely is a mismatch. And these things also have, I want to emphasize, partisan consequences. So another stereotype, which I think comes back to your question about abortion, is that women are more liberal in general, right? And we know from many, many studies that if you just show people a woman candidate, they're going to think she's farther to the left than if you just showed them a male candidate. That is fine and dandy if you are running for a Democratic nomination, because your primary electorate is all in. And in fact, we know that today, this is a recent development, that Democratic primary electorates would prefer, all things equal, to nominate a woman. So women actually have an advantage in that electorate. That is not the case on the Republican side, where women candidates are actually more suspect and have to prove their conservative bona fides in order to be successful. And that's part of the reason that since 1992, before 92, we saw about equal numbers of Democrats and Republicans in Congress. Since 1992, we've had only a slight increase on Republicans. It's been pretty stagnant. And the number of Democratic women in Congress has dramatically accelerated. I promise just one more thing. You asked about connecting that to voters. In general, it's not a good idea to infer the attitudes of the mass public from the behavior of elites and vice versa. So for example, women in general may be more compassionate, et cetera. That's not the same thing as saying that the women who make it through this incredibly competitive process and become members of Congress are themselves super compassionate women. Maybe they are, maybe they're not. Vice versa, just because women are in political office and in activism are associated with certain views, we often assume that that's what women in the mass electorate look like, and that's an inferential failure as well.
Another question that just came in ties, of course, I think everyone's thinking about the 2020 election, so a lot of our questions have been directed me back to 2020.
That's my business. That's what we have to talk about in election years.
Someone asks, do you think there's anything that Trump could do to shift the gender gap or gender lead in the remaining weeks before the election?
I think that Democrats, I'm sorry, was the question what could Trump can do, or either?
What could Trump could do to shift it in his back in his favor?
I think that it is not a coincidence. It's not a coincidence that at the Coney Barrett hearings, Democrats could not stop talking about the vote about the ACA. So it wasn't all these other things you might have said about Coney Barrett. It was about healthcare, and that these are the issues that I've tried to already convince you that women care a lot about and that they vote on. And so, emphasizing that. Whatever you think about this nominee and whatever you think about President Trump versus Joe Biden is more going to protect things like, again, pre-existing conditions. It's why Donald Trump a few weeks ago announced an executive order that he claimed would protect pre-existing conditions forever and always, right? To talk about those sorts of issues. I think that Trump himself, it's harder to get a gauge on what his advisors think and how much they can sort of control what he says, is really actually doubling down on sort of a mobilize your base strategy, right? Certainly he's not trying to appeal to Black voters at all, but sort of using the strategies that were successful for him in 2016 to try and get as many of those people out. And what we saw in 2016 was that some Democratic constituencies, Black voters, some less well-educated white voters didn't really get to the polls for Hillary Clinton. And I think part of Biden's story is going to be whether or not he can do better. It's always important to remember that if 80,000 votes had gone a different way across Wisconsin, Michigan, and Pennsylvania, we'd be having a very different discussion right now.
Earlier in your talk, related to the gender gap, but a separate point that you made that's really interesting is about turnout rates. And a couple folks in the audience are curious about why women are turning out at higher rates than men are, and if there are any reasons or explanations that might vary along racial lines or age or other demographic factors.
Yeah, it's a great question. The way political scientists tend to think about the decision to turn out is as a cost-benefit analysis, which is to say, what are the costs, right? The more costs there are, the less likely you are to turn out, right? And so we can think about, as well we should, barriers to voting during a pandemic and the cost that that puts onto voters, and how it doesn't have to keep all of them from the polls, but if it keeps 10 out of 100, that's going to make a difference on the election. And then we think of the benefits, right? So how far apart do voters imagine the candidates to be? And the bigger you think the benefit is of your person winning, the more likely you are to turn out to vote. And I think we're seeing a lot of that on both sides, right? The Democrats are very motivated to vote because they believe that Donald Trump is so far away from their ideal point, right, that it's worth whatever cost there might be. Republicans are trying to make a similar claim, right? That Joe Biden is so out of touch, Kamala Harris is so out of touch, that you should really care about who wins on election day. The truth is, however, and strictly speaking, the question of benefits always depends upon you actually deciding who wins that election. And I hate to tell you that even if you lived in Florida in 2000, you are probably not deciding the election on election day, right? And that means that, you know, to put it cynically, from a political science point of view, we're sort of surprised anybody turns out to vote because your vote is a sort of rough tool, and you're not going to sort of affect the outcomes. And where we fall down on that is what we say is, so as one famous scholar said, the problem is people do vote. And so we have to be able to explain that. And what we tend to do is emphasize the social, expressive, and sort of duty benefits of voting. People vote because voting is a public ritual in which we reaffirm that we are American citizens, that we live in a democracy, and that we choose our leaders. We go because of the positive feelings that it gives us. I think one of the places you're going to see research after 2016 is on, as so many barriers have come up, now this has become almost an act of resistance. I will stand in line for 6 hours and vote because you are not going to take away from me this, that I'm a citizen. I swear I'm getting to women. It turns out that we know across a lot of sort of psychological and political psych studies that women tend to be socialized to a stronger sense of duty, right? They're supposed to be good girls. We know that they are rewarded for following the rules, for doing their part, sort of a thing, in a way that's different from boys. And so part of the answer is, as the original socialization, I should say, women who came of political age before suffrage remained less likely to vote their entire lives, right? They'd learned this is not an appropriate thing for women to do, voting is a habit, all that sort of stuff. So I think that explains women in general, but it also tells us a lot about Black women specifically. And those who sort of look at that constituency very closely report, you know, incredibly high feelings of commitment to community, of a need to vote not just for yourself, but to represent your entire community, your neighborhood, folks like you, whatever that might be. And that seems to be really key for overcoming some of these other barriers to voting, is particularly in minority communities, this responsibility that women of color feel to represent their communities.
Given that women turn out in such high levels, relatively speaking, is it a fair inference that the candidate who wins the presidency? Is there some truth to that statement, or does that not track?
I think you hear a lot about women, and the claim is that women are swing voters. There's not actually a lot of evidence that women are more of a swing constituency than men are, that they're swinging, that usually means they're swinging to the winner, right? And they're voting, there's more variability between elections. We really don't see a ton of evidence of that. It is certainly the case, well, I was gonna say, getting a majority of women's votes certainly is going to help a great deal when it comes to the popular vote. And I should mention that even though it wasn't until 1980 that women were more likely to vote than men, there have been more women in the presidential electorate since 1964. because we don't die. And so there are simply more women of voting age in the population at any one time. So even when a slightly lower percentage of us voted, there were simply more of us. And so that's important. As I probably don't need to tell this audience, however, we do not select a president by popular vote. And so a lot of women in California overwhelmingly supporting Biden is going to have the same impact on how many electoral college votes Biden gets as if a small majority of women vote for Biden. And in those states where things are closer, in those battleground states, 51% of women probably helps. It might not be enough. And that's sort of the, and then we want to think about what kind of women live in what kind of states, and what's the gender gap going to look in that. So if you're in a state where 70% of the men vote Republican and only 60% of women do, you're still going to Trump. So I don't know if that helps, but.
No, it does. It does. I think we might only have time for one more question, but we'll see how many I can sneak in. But I wanted to zoom out in terms of the timeline a little bit and ask you, not a question about 2020, but a question about the concept of the gender gap that you sort of discussed at the beginning of your talk, that it was part of a political strategy when that term was developed and that it was deployed by activists. And I'm just personally very curious to hear about who came up with that and what was the purpose of that concept.
Well, so the very specific story, and I apologize that we don't have more questions. I give very long answers. My undergraduates would tell you that's just the way it goes. So be careful when you ask questions. Literally the term gender gap came because in 1981, the Democratic National Committee was getting together to do their holy crap, we lost debrief. Where do we go from here? Remember, the Democrats also lost the Senate in 1980. And activists, including Molly Yard, one-time president of the National Organization for Women, were asked to give a presentation on women voters. And literally they had their little chart showing kind of what I just showed you, women, how they voted. And they had a column of the difference between men and women. And they were like, what do we call this column? We're going to call it the gender gap. Right. And then this became, and I should say that Ms. Magazine had a gender gap cover in the spring, right? We want to emphasize the political power of women, especially because, right, the ERA was still being debated. Ronald Reagan is seen as sort of this return to more conservatism. And so the left in general, but feminists in particular, were making that case. It is not a coincidence that in 1984, Democrats nominated a woman vice president for the very first time. That was a feminist demand, and certainly the party believed that that would help them take advantage of that emerging gender gap. Every interest out there, whether it's gun owners or retirees or whatever it is, have lots of ways that they try to get government to be responsive to them. But saying you've got a bunch of voters who care about your issue behind you is a really good way to do that. And so we're going to see that. Among feminists, among all sorts of different constituencies, and I don't expect that to go away.
Well, thank you very much, Christina. That was engaging and informative and very enjoyable. Possibly the most enjoyable talk on the subject of the 2020 election I've ever heard. That's a low bar. But thank you also to members of the quote unquote audience out there. And I hope you appreciate it as well. If we were together, I would lead everyone in a round of applause and thanks for Professor Wolbrecht. And I'm going to do that anyway, even though, maybe.
Thank you very much.
Thank you very much for a great talk.
Be well, everybody. Thanks so much.